Hey, MBA hopefuls, welcome to MBA Waves. We are live on the air. Today in episode 157, we're talking about bringing your most competitive application for round two. We're bringing on the focus on what we're hearing through the grapevine about round two. What do business schools really want, and how you can absolutely shine. I'm your host for today, Eric Lucrezia, joined by my co-host, Krithika. How are you?
Hi, doing great.
Welcome, Krithika. And today we have a special guest, our friend and colleague, Melody Jones of Vantage Point MBA Admissions Consulting. A big welcome to you. How are you, Melody?
Thank you. I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
We're excited to have you too. Round two deadlines are coming up soon. When we think of round two, for many schools, that's in early January and then kind of throughout the rest of the month of January. But some schools have a different system. More frequent deadlines, additional deadlines. So we'll get into that in a moment, but let's just get into it right away. So, Melody, as an admissions consultant, you are on the front lines of candidates applying to business school. Could you please share with our listeners how the business school application round system functions?
Sure. I'm glad you asked about that because I think sometimes there can be confusion around what do we even mean when we're talking about round one versus round two versus any other round number. So typically the top MBA programs will batch the deadlines when they want applicants to submit their finalized applications, and they call them rounds. And so round one is typically in September throughout early October. And then round two is typically in January. And then round three, which is the final round, is in the spring, so usually March or April. And so these are firm deadlines when you have to have all of your finalized application materials submitted, and then the admissions committee will review all of the applications that they received within that batch, and then deliver decisions and interview invites on their set timeline. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you wanted to comment on like other rounds or early action rounds, what that might mean. While we're just talking,
Yeah. So of course, it can never be straightforward and easy. Quite a few programs do have some kind of twists and turns in their policies. So actually a couple of years ago, Columbia was one of the only programs that kind of deviated from the round system, and they actually had more of a rolling admissions process. That is no longer the case. However, there are still a handful of programs that will have early decision or early action deadlines. So in some cases, like in the case of Tuck, for example, this year, I believe the early action deadline was actually September 1st for round one, and then it'll be December 1st or around there for round two. And this is an early deadline where if you apply by that deadline, then you will be guaranteed an interview invite, for example. Or in other cases, if you apply by a certain deadline, you are also committing to that school if you're accepted and if you agree to the terms of their early action binding agreement. So really, it's just a way for them to sort of manage their admissions process, manage yield, and keep sort of their staff from getting completely overworked and swamped at key points in the application process. And it also helps applicants obviously time out their process and decide which is going to be the best timeline for them to submit their application, and then work backwards to create the right process to get their ducks in a row.
Yeah, awesome. Before Krithika takes on the next question, you mentioned a word, binding, but before you come to that, before I ask you to define that a little bit more, some of the schools that typically have early action, or at least this year in this cycle, are Duke Fuqua, Georgetown McDonough, UK Darden. Those are early action prior to round one, right? And round one, again, like it's typically that September or October timeframe. Round two, wintertime. But there are exceptions. Most schools in the US have a round three. Harvard famously does not. They only have the 2 rounds, right? And then there are some schools, again, Duke with the round 4. NYU also, Tepper, Texas McCombs. And then you look over the other side of the pond. There's all sorts of stuff going on. Like HEC famously has like an admissions round almost every single month of the year. I believe there's 10 throughout the year. INSEAD is a little bit offset. Oxford Said has a little slightly different system. So anyways, you really have to look at each school case by case. But I wanted to come back to that term. I also meant to click that earlier. I wanted to come back to that term you mentioned, binding. Could you just share what that means a little bit?
Yeah, so some programs even offer you the option of selecting binding early decision or non-binding early decision. And what binding really means is that you are committing to attending that program if you are accepted through the application cycle where you commit to the terms of the binding agreement. And so really it's just a way for business schools to manage yield, and obviously for you as an applicant to really express your commitment and adoration of that particular program if it is your top choice, because that way you're literally telling them, if you accept me, I am going to kiss all of my other options goodbye and happily sign on the dotted line and typically put down a larger than average deposit.
Right.
I was smiling along, because we just had this chat before the conversation started about like how all these rounds affect our holidays, especially round two, which can be very detrimental to your holiday plans if you don't plan it out, especially with recommenders absconding or being unavailable. And with some of the famous schools out there with January 4th and 5th and 6th deadlines, we all know who they are. I think one of the main concerns that a lot of MBA hopefuls have is there any difference between all these rounds in terms of chances of getting admitted? And should they even what kind of risk are probably surrounding round two? Should they even go for it or stick to only round one? So what's your take on that?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right? And I think, chances of acceptance between rounds is something that schools don't publish. And obviously it's going to vary from year to year anyways. But what I would always encourage applicants to look at is their individual situation, because their individual situation is going to be a far greater determinant of their chances of admission than any overall acceptance rates between one round to another. All else being equal, a competitive applicant, I believe, and I've seen this in my experience, has an equal chance of being accepted in round one versus round two, unless they come from an overrepresented demographic or they come to the process with some other weakness or sort of gap in their profile that would make it more favorable for them to apply in round one. But a competitive, strong applicant, round one or round two, I'm going to say you have equal chances. Another thing that I'll add, and this is just an interesting data point, admissions consultants and companies like ours, right? We have like a very narrow viewpoint into a very small subset of the applicant pool. I mean, there's 20,000 people or so around the world that are applying to the top programs every year. And we're seeing a fraction of that. But what I will say is that my firm works with the large majority of consultants from one of the top management consulting firms. And what we see amongst their cohort is that the folks that apply, the majority of them apply in round one, but the folks that actually wait until round two have been accepted at a higher rate, statistically speaking. And so whether that's reflective of, the round two applicants just being a stronger batch, or maybe having kind of fewer peers to compete with, right? Because that pool is smaller. It's an interesting phenomenon that I honestly didn't expect to see, but it's been the case now for the last 3 years. All that said, every situation is so applicant specific. And so I never recommend any applicant make decisions about one round over another just because they feel like, oh, my chances are going to be lower in round two. Like, yes, acceptance rates may be lower in round two, but you also have to think about the fact that the round two applicant pool is generally less strong than the round one applicant pool. So it's just a different ballgame.
It's true. It's really hard to kind of crack the code, so to speak. I know a lot of people, if you look at the blogs like Reddit and Beat the GMAT, there's so much garbage that gets passed around there. I would just say ignore that. Yeah. But you see so many people who are just trying to figure out how to calculate their chances. And I'm like, instead of doing that, why don't you spend your time on being the best applicant you can be?
It's going to have way far more impact on their chances than anything else.
Yeah. That time reflecting on who am I? What am I good at? What do I want to do? Research that school deeply. Reach out to another 10 alumni and talk to them. Attend that other event, whether it's a fair organized by a third party or the school itself. Or train harder for the test, the GMAT or the GRE. In some cases, you know what I mean? focus on yourself. Don't worry about what other people are doing, because you're never going to figure it out, and B, it doesn't really mean anything because you can't control these variables. And
so much of the data out there, if there is data, is skewed anyways, right? Like nobody has a perspective on the entire applicant pool, except for the schools, and they're never going to share that data. So
and Melanie, I'm very interested in the data that we shared, because one thing I can tell of round 2 applicants who are targeting a very common field like consulting, investment banking, and glamorous fields which are like sought after by many is that they really put in the hard work because they know that they have to stand out, and it could be from having a better test score. They know that consultants will need a very high test score, so like going beyond the average in most schools. It could also be like building the leadership skills that are needed with the extra 2 to 3 months that is available between round 1 and round 2.
Right.
So that could also be the reason for it, but it was a fascinating data point.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think management consultants often tend to apply to business school 1 to 2 years earlier than the average applicant anyways, just because of the rigor of their work experience and the speed at which they progress. So it makes sense, but those extra 3 months could make all the difference, right? Into getting that promotion in the fall and having their first case assignment where they've been able to operate at a higher leadership level. And that could make a huge impact on the perspective they can share in their essays.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. So Melody, how does one best stick to applying to round 2, right? With all the things they have to deal with, what is an ideal timeline for each of the application components?
Oh man, I wish you'd asked me that question a month ago, because, I feel like at this point, if you haven't started anything in the application process, I'm a little worried for you, I'll be honest. I think there's a lot of moving pieces that go into submitting an A+ application in essentially less than 6 weeks. And you have 3 holidays here in the US peppered in between there. That said, it's not impossible. I've seen it done. We have a handful of clients every year that we decide to help them on their mad dash to the finish line. I would say that, the most important thing in starting point is what are the things that depend on your schedule and what are the things that depend on other people's schedule? And you always want to put the other people first, right? And so, Krithika, you mentioned recommenders earlier, right? I mean, recommenders are absolutely the #1 supporters that you need on your side. And nothing's going to upset them more than if you jam them over the holiday break when they were finally excited to go spend time with their kids that they hadn't been able to see in weeks prior due to the craziness of year end. So you definitely want to get in front of them as soon as possible and give them all the information they need. And same goes for any kind of school research you still need to do, right? Whether you need to have coffee chats with current students or see if you can grab sort of the last info session of the year at any of the top schools because you haven't had a chance to engage with them in that way. Those are all things that you want to do first. And then after that, everything that else that depends on your schedule, you want to build your application process systematically, right? So don't sit down and say, okay, I'm going to randomly tackle essay 2 from the Wharton application, right? You want to sit down and say, okay, what are the big questions, repeated themes that are going to be across all of my applications, right? Which are like, who am I? What is my experience? What do I want to do? Why do I want an MBA, right? All these like very big but important questions. And then from there, you can sort of track it down to school by school applications. And depending on your writing style and how quickly you can start putting thoughts on paper and get feedback from whether that's a consultant or a friend or a colleague, making sure that you're giving them time to offer that feedback. So it's not easy. You gotta be disciplined and literally plan on spending every single day on something application related.
And I have to mention the year-end pressure that is there for many applicants in their jobs. It can be like taxing to close the year. And the mad dash to the finish line is what I would say it is.
Yeah.
Both the applicants and the admissions coaches.
Exactly.
So what trends are you seeing from round 1 of fall 2025? And how do you think that's going to impact round 2 candidates?
Yeah, good question. I gave this some thought before we got on the session today. You had mentioned this was something we were going to talk about. And, to me, I'm always hesitant to extrapolate one or two anecdotes and say, here's a trend, right? Because you just don't know what you don't know. But I do feel like one thing I can confidently say has sort of been an overarching theme or factor in this year's application cycle has just been the election in the US. And so, what I saw for round one is sort of this like bifurcation of clients or applicants, right? So the round one folks this year, unlike last year where I saw, quite a bit of like frantic energy and like this pressure to submit their applications this year because they didn't know what was happening with the job market. This year, I saw a lot more thoughtfulness, really a lot of time and effort and work that went into buttoned up round one applications. And then I saw a whole new swath of people essentially wake up in the last 2 weeks and say, oh, wait, I think I need to apply to business school this year. What do I need to do? And so, to those round two folks, I say, listen, I mean, it's not impossible, right? You definitely have your work cut out for you. And depending on what efforts you've made towards the application process before this, you may be able to pull it off. But I will say this, I think the bar is set high by round one folks this year. And, being distracted by the election or anything else that was sort of going on in a larger societal context. And a lot of folks also struggled with the GMAT, which is an extra or a separate topic. But overall, I feel like this year's round two applicants have big shoes to fill, and it's going to show pretty quickly and easily if they're kind of throwing in a half-baked application, or if this was something that they were really thoughtful about, similar to their round one peers, and just needed that extra time to button up some loose ends or get the test score that they needed or what have you.
Yeah, I think you're right about definitely some of the trends, like the election, right? We saw in, I guess it was summer 2023, a couple of U.S. Supreme Court decisions, some big ones that had an impact on, well, everyone in the U.S., including admissions. And, I remember when Trump won in 2016, we sort of anticipated, I was at the time working for a French business school, increased numbers in other parts of the world and a drop in the US. And that's indeed what we saw. This time around, who knows? There's some people that say it might actually go the other way around, depending on what people are feeling. And there's also I don't like, kind of reducing it down to red state, blue state stuff, but it does also come down to that as well, like where exactly you want to be studying and living and working post MBA.
Yeah. And there's so much speculation and I think fear, and fear rightfully so, right? It's hard to imagine packing up your bags if, not a US citizen, you've lived and worked in another country in the world, and then pack up your bags, incur, 6 figures of US dollar debt. And then, not really knowing, like, are the systems that are in place for, my friend who just graduated this year, are they still going to be there for me? Yes or no? Lots of people have opinions. Not a whole lot of people are operating on fact.
Yeah, having done that before and having seen so many of my clients go through that, I will say that takes a tremendous amount of courage.
Oh my gosh.
And conviction, and about the amount of risk that one can take.
Yeah.
And also about the pressure that one can take, right? The whole feeling that I can do it. And it's mad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And adaptability, right? Like knowing that no matter what, something isn't going to work out along the way you thought it would. And being able to adapt and still land on your feet. It's not an easy task.
Well, that's it. You're talking about like kind of political, social change or potentially instability. And, look at all the unfortunate war and other political and military instability going on all over the world. So things are unpredictable, and, being adaptable is the name of the game. And by the way, one of the, let's say, sexiest skills you can talk about in your essay as far as getting into an MBA and getting a job afterwards, right? The sands are always changing, shifting. And as a leader, to be able to recognize them, figure out what to do to make that change, and to communicate that change to your team, getting everyone on board with you. That said, Melody, could you maybe share a couple stories from your own round two applicants? Obviously not naming any names, but anything stand out to you?
From this year or from prior years?
Could be from prior, absolutely. I think it's
Yeah,
absolutely.
I feel like for this year, right, they're still in process. So who knows the way the cookie will crumble. But yeah, so, it's funny thinking back to round two, there's definitely two types of applicants, like I talked about earlier, right? There's the folks who were very thoughtful and decided that round two was the best round for them because they were waiting for promotion to go through, or they were finishing like a secondment, or there was a big project, right, that they wanted to wrap up at work and be a core part of their application, and it just made sense for that round two timeline. And the stories for those folks are very similar to the ones from round one. And then the other bucket, right, is the folks that all of a sudden wake up in November and say, oh, shoot, I need to apply to business school this year. This is my last round to have decent chances of acceptance. I need to do whatever it takes.
Expire.
Yeah, exactly. So, I can definitely share a story from each. It's funny, one woman that I will never forget because of the outcomes of her application literally came to me the week after Thanksgiving. She was an international applicant. But she was living in the US, working in the US, but on a visa. And she needed to apply to business school for round two. There was no other timeline for her to go, or she'd have to go back to her home country. So a lot of pressure on her applications. She had a very interesting story. She worked for, out of college, worked for one of the big US retailer that we may all have heard of, that ended up filing for bankruptcy. And then she ended up working for the acquirer for a while. Had pursued some really, really interesting extracurriculars through helping immigrants settle in the US, and doing a couple of other things through her undergrad institution. And so she applied to 3 schools. I talked her down from 5 because it just wasn't going to be possible in that short of a time frame. So she applied to Yale, Columbia, and HBS. It felt a little risky, but she had a good GMAT score, 730, and a pretty good undergrad GPA. I want to say it was like a 3.5 or 3.6 maybe. So just a tad below average, but definitely within the ballpark of average. And so she really built her application around wanting to lean more into e-commerce, and really develop this concept of social selling, which was really big over in Asia and in other parts of the world that hadn't quite caught on in the US. And so that was her story. That was her vision. Business school made a lot of sense given she had a more technical undergraduate education. And she ended up, this is the craziest part, she ended up rejected from Yale, rejected from Columbia after interview, accepted at HBS.
Was she high on her extracurriculars?
Pardon?
Was she strong in extracurriculars, like community service, volunteering?
Yeah. And it's so interesting to me. This is one I'll never be able to figure out. And I always use this example with my clients when, when they feel like acceptance from one school is indicative, or rejection, right, from one school is indicative of the decisions you'll get from other schools. And that is really not the case, right? It does come down to fit. HBS was, of course, as you can imagine, by far and away her top choice. She put most of her effort into that application. And, for whatever reason, maybe that's shown through, or maybe to the admissions committee, it just didn't feel like her heart was in it. We'll never really know what happened. Round two is also always, at the time, this was a couple years ago, this is also trickier for CBS to apply in round two as an international applicant. But I always think that's a really fun story, and just such a great anecdote to show that you never know the way the cookie's going to crumble. Buttoned up applicants, I would say I worked with an applicant last year who started the application process with me. This would have been back in July. So a little late to the game for round one, but definitely still doable, but he was still studying for the GMAT. He took it 2 times in July and then once in August, still sort of working along his applications, and ended up not getting the GMAT score that he needed. He was a sub 700, and it just wasn't where it needed to be. He had a slightly low undergrad GPA, so he really needed to get that score up. And so we decided to pause the application process, to have him focus on the test for the next 2 months, take it by the end of September, mid-October at the latest, and then resume the application process together. So that's what he did. He ended up working with a tutor that I think made a big difference in his study habits and just making sure that he was really targeting those weak points, and ended up getting the score that he needed. And so we applied to 4 schools together, 4 M7 schools. That was the range that made sense for him, and I felt comfortable with the overall strategy that he laid out. He was your typical like 2 years in banking, 2 years in private equity type of guy. So it was a little risky to push to round 2, to be honest. But I thought the test score was going to make a much bigger difference than any sort of overrepresented demographic risk he was taking from round 1. And his extracurriculars were good, but he had just started them over the summer. And so they were a little late, I would say, to the party. But you know what? I think it's pretty typical, particularly for folks that start off their careers in finance. The work schedule is so demanding and so extreme. It's really hard to find time outside of work for many people, not everyone, obviously, but for many people. So he applied to 4 M7 programs and got interviews at 3 and got accepted to 2 and ended up going to 1.
I always love these success stories.
Yeah.
It just shows like what it takes for all the people to get there. And there was this one applicant who said that, oh my God, like there must be people like me before. And I'm not sure if I should even try, right? This is after they gave their 3rd attempt of GMAT, which I know was like a big hurdle for many in getting the score. But then this person was also on a merchant ship and trying to make the most of their journey, while sailing around the world, literally.
Wow.
So what I would like to say that in round 2, I would say that sometimes it pays to show up.
Yeah.
Just show up if you feel that you have all the things pointed in the right direction, and knowing what it takes to get there. But I mean, I think like there's always this fear of like, what if there was somebody like me in round 1? Especially this is so common for someone from a overrepresented pool. Like 100% sure there would have been so many analysts and so many engineers and so many others going on. But this is where I would say that, you just have to have faith in yourselves to pull up your socks and just try for it. Unless you actually show up, you're not actually going to be in the game. Absolutely. And what I sometimes feel is that since it is getting so competitive, being in round 2 can actually be like a rehearsal for getting to round 1 next year in case you don't get through this year. So what are your thoughts on that?
No, I agree. I mean, one thing that came to mind as you were asking this question is, I tell my clients that, applying with a low test score is a challenge that you have with the test, right? Applying with a half-baked application where you clearly haven't done your homework, you clearly haven't really taken the effort to present a buttoned-up story, thoughtful career goals, recommenders who were really committed to your success and put together great letters. And to me, that's character and that's discipline. And it's harder to come back from making a poor first impression when it's character and discipline than it is saying, hey, I just couldn't crack this test, but maybe you'll still give me a chance. And if you won't, then I'm going to come back to this process next year stronger in every way, not just with a stronger test, but I'm also going to double down on any other part of my application that also could be improved, right? Maybe it's landing a new project at work, or applying to join the board of a nonprofit that I've been involved in, or what have you. But I really do think that applying with sort of a known weakness that in some ways is a little bit outside your control versus just throwing in a Hail Mary application just to say, hey, what if this does work out? I always encourage people to be respectful of the admissions committee's time. Yes, their job is to maximize applications, right? Because that makes their school look good. But also, if you're making them read through, a C- product, that's their your time that you're taking up when you could have maybe waited until round 1 next year and had a much more solid application. So I always frame it that way, and I think it helps folks sort of help them decide what's going to make sense and where they should be spending their efforts.
So it sort of gets a little bit cart before the horse, because we were going to ask about scholarships next between round 1 and round 2. But since we're talking about like holding off, from rushing around to that, would you call it a C minus, application in terms of quality versus a buttoned up A+ application, there's also round 3. So what are your thoughts about round 3, if you don't mind?
I don't like round 3. I typically won't agree to work with round 3 applicants unless there's something truly exceptional at play. So whether unforeseen illness or the timing of military service, or someone that already maybe has an acceptance from an earlier round, but just wants to see if maybe they could explore a different avenue in round 3, for example. In those situations, I think it could still be worth the effort, but those are exceptions, right? And it's never a smart strategy for applicants to assume that they will be the exception to the rule. The truth is, Harvard entirely got rid of their round 3 cycle because they didn't see a lot of value in it. I'm guessing they accepted so few applicants, it just wasn't worth the effort. But I think for most programs, round 3 should be kind of like a worst case scenario type of round, but in most cases, I'm always going to recommend applying in round 1 of the following year. I do want to caveat this by saying I'm referring right now to the top 10 MBA programs in the US. I don't think that is necessarily the same advice I would use for someone who's kind of applying to programs outside the top 25, or applicants who are applying to MBA programs in Europe that might have different deadlines and application cycles. And in my experience, the European programs see a little bit more of an even cadence between rounds compared to the US.
And I want to remind international applicants that round 3 is not applicable to them, and it's only round 1 and round 2. So if you really want to go.
Yep, absolutely.
Looks like Bara's watching us from, I believe she's at Hana layover in Denver Airport, which is why she couldn't join us today.
Great.
Yeah, and she says like the test score you can change more dramatically in the least time. Yeah, I definitely agree.
Absolutely.
So we talked about like how admits don't necessarily change between the rounds, but what about the scholarship opportunities and possibilities of other opportunities
between 1 and 2? You mean, right?
Yeah. Generally, so that's probably the only difference that I always highlight to folks about round 1 versus round 2. And that's just that for round 1, you do have a better chance of getting a scholarship because they have 100% of the scholarship pool still available, right? And so as the pool shrinks, the criteria for earning that scholarship is going to go get higher, just because there's only so many dollars that can go around, and the schools want to make sure they're being allocated to the right people and the best people and the students that they want the most badly, that they are concerned might be also being wooed by other MBA programs. So if getting a scholarship, a merit-based scholarship, I should clarify, getting a merit-based scholarship is a priority for you in your application process, I would strongly recommend applying in round 1 to maximize your chances of getting a scholarship. That said, Harvard and Stanford don't even offer merit-based scholarships. It's only need-based. So that should factor in your decision to apply to those programs. And need-based financial aid is not dependent on which round you apply in. So my answer there is fully referencing merit-based aid.
Nice. All right, so let's bring it home because we're starting to run out of time for today. Let's just ask this one thing that round 2 applicants need to focus on right now. What's your best bit of advice that you can send home with our applicants?
Oh man, I think I'm going to go back to what I said before, and that is create a timeline and a game plan for the 5 weeks and change ahead. and literally map out what you're going to do every single day and do not deviate from that plan. Consistency is so, so, so important in this process. And I know you might be saying, oh, well, I work better under pressure. And, oh, you know, I've always been able to pull it off somehow at the last minute. Okay, that's great. But you know what? I've not seen that be a successful strategy in MBA applications in 99% of cases. So create that timeline, create a game plan, and over budget for essays because they always take more time than you think they will.
I think that's some pretty solid advice. And as for those who work better under pressure, and this is like me too.
Me too.
I think the real answer is
for me.
Yeah, I know, and I don't always follow my own advice, but I think procrastinators only start under pressure. But if you're, it's not always the case. You have to set those like, small like benchmark deadlines along the way to get things rolling. At least that's what works for me. But the thing is, if you're waiting to the end, even if you feel that you do work better under pressure, you still have a shorter timeline where you have less time to catch mistakes you might have made along the way, and there's just more risk for making errors that could, you know, put it at big risk your applications.
Yeah. And making a change in one place always has like, you know, domino effects in other parts of the application that you might not catch right on a first pass. So
I mean, there's that kind of rule where you don't repeat, right? You're not going to say something in one essay and then also talk about that story in a second essay or somewhere else, right? So if you've made a change in an essay that you now want to include something, you may have forgotten that you've already said that somewhere else. So you want to have that buffer time to do a final run through. This is for any round, I would say, though. You know, if the deadline is, as you know, some schools have a deadline on January 6th. So for you, why don't you say it's January 2nd, or better yet, December 30th? Something tends to happen in between. And then you have that buffer time just in case.
Right.
Yeah, my advice to applicants right now will be that you don't have any time for course correction, and please do not schedule a GMAT 2 days before the deadline of any school. Not going to work out. It doesn't go well at all.
No, just go with the score you got.
Yeah. Well, all right, guys, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Melody. This has been really interesting. Some great advice. It was great to have you on the show, and we hope to have you back again. Guys, if you liked today's episode, please give us a little thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to MBA Waves on our YouTube channel to stay on top of the latest trends. And as always, all the information for upcoming episodes is on our website, mbawaves.com. See you guys, and best of luck for round 2. Bye.
Bye. Good luck, everybody.